Hello and welcome to this round 11 here of Grand Prix Prague, and we're going to get a second chance to see Camilo Lucic with his Cornucopia deck, as we called it, up against Felix Steinitzer on Amulet Titan. So we got a chance to see this deck in the first round of day 2, and it is a spicy one. This is a list that uses a lot of different ways of putting charge counters on artifacts and can create some very, very powerful interactions with it, and in the meantime gets to be just a cool artifact control deck in the midst of all that, up against Amulet Titan.
Yeah, Camilo's deck is quite a brew. It's somewhat reminiscent of Lantern Control in that it does have Ensnaring Bridge and Verve Invention to find it, along with lots of cheap artifacts to empty your hand. But, wow, it's 2 Mox Opals along with Metalcraft on turn 1. And this deck is firing on all cylinders. So, Core Tapper is a card that helps with Astral Cornucopia, which, you know, is kind of meant to be cast for 3 mana. But when you have Core Tapper, you can, get extra charge counters onto the Astral Cornucopia that way. So if Camilo wants, for example, you can put a charge counter on there, maybe even sacrifice the Core Tapper if need be, and then tap the Astral Cornucopia for, as many charge counters are on it currently. So he has access to a whole lot of mana. At this point, though, only 1 card remaining in hand.
Exploded onto the battlefield early doors. Just needs to find a way of refueling here. And transmuting Teleria West, not a bad thing to be doing here at all. There are a lot of powerful 0-cost cards in his deck. Be they Inventor's Fair to search up whatever artifact he so chooses, or indeed one of a whole host of artifacts, not least the likes of Chalice of the Void, in order to make sure that he can potentially stop all sorts of things. Because don't forget, Chalice of the Void, it cares about charge counters. You can play it for 0, then use that Core Tapper in order to put more counters on it to make other spells countered anytime they get cast. Goes to the Inventor's Fair here, though. That means that he can set up to fetch any artifact whatsoever next turn.
Yeah, and in the first round of today, we already saw Camilo fetch Crucible of Worlds out of his deck, and then recast the Inventor's Fair to effectively get a free artifact every turn from then on. When you have, let's say, the Core Tapper, Astral Cornucopia engine to ensure you have plenty of mana available, that is a pretty sweet game plan. Now, meanwhile, Felix Steinitzer, who was one of the 2 Amulet Titan players in the feature match area last round, who managed to win with Zakama, out of all cards I wasn't immediately expecting to see in Modern today. He's playing the Amulet Titan deck that is all based around Amulet of Vigor, and then lands, like the 2-mana lands that you see here, that enter the battlefield tapped, but that will immediately untap for a big mana boost. The main plan for this deck is to ramp into a quick Primeval Titan, fetch, for example, Boros Garrison and Slayer Stronghold, which immediately untap thanks to the Amulet, pump the Titan, give it haste, and just keep going that way until you have won the game.
Both of these decks absolutely exploding in the early turns here. Turn 1, Amulet of Vigor is where you want to be with the Titan deck, and then being able to play Azusa Lost But Seeking on turn 2 means he's been able to set up an awful lot here and cast an Engineered Explosives. Engineered Explosives, pretty powerful because that Astral Cornucopia, it still has a converted mana cost of 0, meaning it's a very easy one to remove. It's just as well as a Welding Jar, otherwise this would be pretty unfortunate. Yes, Mox Opal gets killed off, but Felix Steinitzer, he's got a lot going on these early turns as well.
Yep, yeah, using the mana left over from the green-blue land, along with the forest to pay for the explosives activation.
And a Surge Node here from Camilo Lucic. This means that he's able to get even more counters on Astral Cornucopia, even more easily. He may not have to be sacrificing that Core Tapper just yet to get lots of mana available. He can just make mana in all sorts of different ways as things stand.
I'm sure that Felix was not the first player who had to read Surge Node over the course of this tournament. Camilo is using a bunch of cards that we haven't really seen at the competitive Modern tables. Meanwhile, Felix is doing exactly what this deck is meant to do. Might even be able to set up a lethal attack here this turn with Primeval Titan.
Yeah, and there's no block and sacrifice shenanigans for Core Tapper in the face of Primeval Titan because it does have Trample. And yeah, Slayer's Stronghold plus a Boros Garrison in order to make sure that he can immediately get stuck in here, and that means that there's going to get to be another attack. There's going to get to be more lands in play, and this is, Sunhome Fortress of Legion territory.
That is indeed what this deck is all about. So Felix, let's see, he is currently searching his deck again for the Titan, or
Yeah,
where we are exactly.
I
He should
believe
still be in his main phase and still has some land drops to make if he wants, I think.
I think he might have gone straight through to attacks. Use that Slayer's Stronghold initially.
Yeah, looks like it. All right, well, he's not going for trying to set up a kill this turn, but, well, you do have a land that can exile the opposing graveyard. That will definitely make things more difficult for Camilo.
Yeah, no longer...
That Crucible of Worlds action, for instance, available. Also lots of mana by bouncing and replaying the same Growth Chamber.
We've got a Teleria West mirror on our hands.
Yep.
I think Teleria West might be, aside from basic lands, the only card that these two decks share.
And I think there's Pact of Negation being found there.
It would make sense to me when you can see that your opponent is clearly doing some crazy combo things. Even if you're not quite sure what the combo is, Counter Magic's probably a good option.
Yeah, at least many people in this event will have seen the Amulet Titan deck before, but for Camilo's deck, which may just be too slow this particular game because Felix is setting up a lethal attack with Titan on the next. I'm sure that Camilo has had opponents where he went, I don't know, Surge Node on turn 1, and the opponent had a turn 2 Meddling Mage and had no clue at all what to name. Like, I don't know, name another Surge Node, you probably have more. It's surprise value is definitely a thing.
I mean, if you're Camilo Lukesh here, you're going to have to go for something, but knowing that there's a counter spell for at least one of the somethings that you go for, I guess Inventor's Fair means that in principle he might have two big threats this turn, but it's going to be a big ask for him to make it through this game. Primeval Titan, threatening lethal, and counter magic backup.
Yeah, I think Camilo needs to resolve maybe 2 Ensnaring Bridge this turn if he is somehow able to do that. I don't think he has enough mana to even do that, even if he drew Bridge and searches one out of his deck with the Inventor's Fair. Ensnaring Bridge is the key defensive card in his deck that he uses against, well, creature decks, but also against his Amulet Titan deck. But I'm not sure he will be able to find a way to get out of this. Camilo's deck does have access to an infinite damage combo, which we've seen earlier today, with Filigree Sages, a creature that can untap any artifact for 3 mana. So that combined with an Astral Cornucopia with 4 or more counters is effectively infinite mana. And then you can use, for example, Walking Ballista to win the game.
I very much like the way that Felix Steinitz crafted his turn last turn. He could have gone for a more aggressive plan to get more damage through, but between Bajuka Bog and Pact of Negation, he set up a situation where for a combo deck that he doesn't necessarily understand the details of what it might be doing yet, he has a lot of cards that can meaningfully disrupt it. And Camilo just passing things back here.
Yeah, now with Sunhome Fortress of the Legion in the deck to give the Primeval Titan double strike, it is quite likely that Felix will be able to attack for lethal here.
So a Vigilant attack coming on in now.
So it's maybe Vesuva to copy the Boris Garrison and Sunhome.
You called it. Here we go.
Sounds like a plan.
And a double striking Primeval Titan takes down game 1. Considering the number of turns played there were an awful lot of points of interaction and spells cast in that game.
Yeah, well, like both players had their decks fire on all cylinders. I do think that if both players have, let's say, a perfect draw, that Felix's deck is just a bit faster. Whereas, I mean,
I mean, a perfect draw. We're talking about a turn 2 will from Camilo's deck.
Well, it is possible, I guess, to like win on turn 2 with Camilo's deck with the perfect draw, but like a more realistic draw. I think in general, Felix's deck is a bit more consistent in terms of setting up his game plan quickly, whereas Camilo, he may still need like a few turns, right? Going through all the motions of first charging up his Astral Cornucopia, then tutoring for an Inventor's Fair, then fairing for Crucible of Worlds, then getting back the Inventor's Fair, activating it again. You get there in the end, but it can take a long time, and he's not getting a lot of time in this particular matchup.
Yeah, this is one of those matchups where Camilo, I think, maybe needs to hope to draw the cards that he would normally be hoping to search for, just so that he saves a turn or two here and there.
Yep. So looking at the sideboards, of course, that can change some things as well. Camilo has some potentially relevant cards. Beast Within, it is at least an answer to Primeval Titan if need be. Damping Sphere, which means that the 2 mana lands can only tap for 1 mana, could be relevant. Maybe another Welding Jar to protect against the artifact destruction that Felix is likely to bring in, because Felix does have 3 copies of Abrade in his sideboard, which is a perfect disruptive card for this matchup.
I mean, how do you feel about the likes of the cards that impact on non-creature spells? I mean, something like Rurik Thar the Unbowed seems like the sort of card that it might just be that once it's in play, Camilo Lukesh can't really get anything done.
Could be good. Not as powerful as against, say, a Karklan Ironworks combo deck, because if Camilo already has some of his pieces in play, well, eventually he just needs to find 2 creatures, Filigree Sages and Walking Ballista, to win. So, not sure that Rurik Thar by itself will be a guaranteed win, but it could still be a reasonable option to add.
And we do get to see a little bit more counter magic potentially in this game too, as Spell Pierce, another option available to Felix Steinitzer. His list seems to have a fair bead on the format in terms of the different decks that he might find himself up against here. And I mean, if he gets a draw anything like he got in game 1, then he's going to pose a real threat, because turn 1 Amulet into turn 2 Azusa is about as good as the starts get from Amulet Titans lists these days.
Yeah, that is what you're hoping for when you build the deck together. I think what this matchup may come down to is whether or not Camilo is able to get an Ensnaring Bridge on the table before Felix has an attacking Primeval Titan. Of course, Felix also has cards like Abrade or Engineered Explosives to deal with with this Ensnaring Bridge. But when it comes to, let's say, this infinite damage combo that I described, that Camilo has access to, that just takes a long time to assemble. And his deck, if I look at it, it feels more like a, kind of a Lantern-esque control deck, except with this infinite damage combo with Astral Cornucopia, Filigree Sages and Walking Ballista, instead of winning with Lantern of Insight and Codex Shredder. But it is not the type of deck that is well suited to get this combo out as quickly as possible. There's only 1 Filigree Sages in the deck. It is more of an incidental win condition than trying to combo out.
Now, each of these players currently on X and 2. 2 losses thus far for each player. That means that right now, there's still the potential for them to make the top 8. Obviously, at the start of the tournament, everyone in principle can make top 8. But with 8 wins, you're starting to begin to look in that direction. Once you pick up that 3rd loss, though, I mean, our tournament started off with 1,999 players, and it strikes me that the 3rd loss will be a telling one in terms of hopes of top 8 here.
Yeah, I would be very surprised if a player with 3 losses would get in. One thing to point out about both of these decks is that they don't really rely on the graveyard. Recently, we've seen a surge in decks in Modern that rely on abusing the graveyard, such as Bridgefine, but also the whole Karklan Ironworks combo deck, which needs Scrap Trawler and Mirror Retriever to go off. Both of these decks, apart from an incidental Crucible of Worlds or something like that, can easily win without having to use their graveyard. This means that popular sideboard cards like Leyline of the Void or Rest in Peace are not going to be affecting them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that between these two decks, it's a very thin line. In Felix Steinitz's list, he does have a Ramanap Excavator in his sideboard, so the potential to get key lands back from the graveyard that way. But really, these decks operating largely with their hand in the battlefield. And interestingly, in terms of Amulet Titan and its positioning in the metagame, it's also a list that, if it happens to play against a deck that's bringing lots of artifact disruption, it certainly can win without needing to have the Amulet of Vigor in play. And indeed, once you start looking at decks that can win without needing artifacts or the graveyard, the kind of hate that they can come up against is actually comparatively minimal.
Yep. But artifact hate's still pretty powerful against both decks, really. Well, Camilo has, of course, Mox Opal, Core Tapper, and Ensnaring Bridge, along with a Whir of Invention to find some other pieces. Seems to be the start of a reasonable hand, but maybe he just didn't really have the lands to go with.
Felix Steinitzer, though, appears to be keeping on a full group of 7 here. And I think that one of the interesting tests for players when they're playing decks like Amulet Titan, obviously we've spoken about, ideally you want to get that Amulet of Vigor out on turn 1, but the more interesting challenge is knowing how to evaluate the medium hands, the hands that have. I mean, clearly you're going to end up with a bunch of lands because the
deck
Amulet deck
so many.
just runs a whole bunch of lands. But it's sort of, what do you need from your opening hands if you don't have your obvious key cards in there? It looks like a Sakura Tribe Scout in hand, for example, for Steinitzer this game. That one of those cards that not quite as explosive as Azusa Lost but Seeking, but still an interesting one in terms of being able to accelerate out lands, and indeed one that's, even if there were artifact removal knocking around, would consistently mean you get to make the most of your powerful lands.
Exactly. With all the bounce lands, it is a great ramp card in getting out the Primeval Titan more quickly. So it looks like Camilo doesn't have like the whole explosive Mox Opal, Astral Cornucopia madness, but I did spot a Chalice of the Void in his hand. That would be still pretty good to put out over here, because it will prevent Felix from, most importantly, resolving Amulet of Vigor. Also, both players run Ancient Stirrings, one of the better card selection spells in Modern. That is also now shut off. Well, that's a lot of mana pretty quickly.
Sakura Tribe Scout setting up Azusa Lost but Seeking, and the bounce lands, you can see, not quite as potent when you don't have the ability to untap them as soon as they come into play, but when you're playing so many additional lands each turn, we have Felix Steinitzer, he's going to be starting his turn 3 with 5 mana's worth of lands in play.
Yeah, he has access to Primeval Titan mana on the next turn. We could be seeing a turn 3 Primeval Titan. No Amulet of Vigor to go with it, but still a pretty good threat.
That was Camilo just asking, I saw that you played lands and then picked lands up with your bounce lands. Can you just remind me which lands you played? And it was a Ghost Quarter and one other slightly less exciting looking land there that Felix has been working with.
I do see the Filigree Sages in Camilo's hand. Without the whole infinite mana combo yet, that card doesn't really do all that much.
But that is also a Whir of Invention to fetch Core Tapper, though, so it's not that far away.
Well, or Bridge. And Snaring Bridge could be useful in trying to stop the Primeval Titan attacks.
Ensnaring Bridge, it's been a key component in a few decks now in Modern. Just a very, very unfair feeling card when you're on the wrong side of it, meaning that you've got this tiny little bridge between the two players that no creatures can reasonably attack through. A Whir of Invention here for 3. Improvise helping quite a bit there. Astral Cornucopia getting to do work even when it wasn't
bit of tectonic activity here.
Core Tapper coming down now. And Core Tapper will mean that it's comparatively easy for Camilo Lukesh to get that Astral Cornucopia up to the point where Filigree Sages will be able to help it make infinite mana.
Mm-hmm. Note also, because Felix did have Primeval Titan mana but didn't play it, going for that ensnaring bridge does not seem as important. So instead Camilo can set up his whole charge counter angle.
Academy Ruins now in play. That an interesting piece of this puzzle. And a Braid here coming along, targeting Astral Cornucopia. This is big.
Well, Camilo does have Welding Jar to save it.
Does though mean that we're going to end up that the Cornucopia is not going to be able to tap for mana because regeneration does tap the
correct. It is
not kept alive.
Yeah, it's not indestructible. And Camilo deciding to keep the Filigree Sages in the hand.
And next turn he gets to tap Core Tapper and sacrifice Core Tapper for a total of 3 additional charge counters. Kind of the key amount. Ghost Courts are now targeting Academy Ruins.
And everyone is still safe here in the hole. There's no actual earthquake going on.
Yeah, so maybe some excited jiggling legs under the table as these two players each try and live their best lives with their decks that can do some very, very powerful things.
I mean, to me, this is what Modern is all about. Such a large card pool, nearly 15 years of cards, and like trying to assemble weird combinations that by themselves look completely unplayable, but when you put it all together, makes for a very powerful machine.
Yeah, I tell you what, if you decide that you want to search through Gatherer for everything in Modern for cool things to do, firstly, it'll take you a bit of time, but secondly, you will find a lot of cool things. This is a format where, keeping in mind cards like Core Tapper and how it interacts with things, it's a long-term game. It's not necessarily something that, when it was printed back in Darksteel, that it was doing too much, but each and every set that comes out, if there's another artifact, if there's another card that references charge counters, I mean, for example, Magistrate's Scepter got reprinted recently. Does that one use charge counters, or are the counters on it called something different? Because that's the sort of thing that the difference ends up being very important when it comes to things like this. It is charge counters. So in principle, you could create something kind of cool with Magistrate's Scepter in this deck if you wanted to, for example.
Yes, that would actually be a reasonable angle.
Whether or not you can go infinite with it, I'm not quite sure. We'll leave that to some other brewer in some other occasion. But
yeah, well, when you have that and then multiple core tappers, it is infinite turns. Hey, when you're going deep with all of these cards, why not? All right, so here we're going to see an Astral Cornucopia tapping for 6 mana.
We got another reader here. This is Filigree Sages, a 1/4 for 3 mana that has the ability that you can pay 2 colorless and a blue mana to untap target artifact, and you can use that ability just as many times as you'd like. And I'm guessing that as many times as you'd like in this case for Camilo Lukesh is going to be quite a lot.
Yeah, and even if Felix has a removal spell for the Filigree Sages, well, you can just untap again in response and make infinite mana regardless. If he does have a Braid, he actually needs to kill the Cornucopia in response to the Sages.
Well, it doesn't look like that's going to happen. Instead, we're going to have a lot of mana and also a lot of untapped. So with a Core Tapper in play, in principle, Camilo could ramp up that Chalice of the Void to whatever number he wanted. As it happens, he's going to cast Whir of Invention for X equals whatever number he fancies.
Yep. This also works because the Astral Cornucopia makes colored mana. Okay, so this is the one of the win conditions. Orochi Hatchery, another card that Felix was probably not expecting to face when he sat down this morning, is well, there you have it. With the by adding a counter to it with Core Tapper, it will then have, well, 1 charge counter. For 5 mana, put a 1/1 green snake creature token onto the battlefield. But when you have when you have infinite mana and the Filigree Sages to untap it as often as you like, well, you can just make a million, billion. Definitely not a squillion. That's not a number. I see Riley Knight looking at me over there. But a Google might be a good number of snake tokens.
Oh, boo. In response to you abrading my Orochi Hatchery, make that number to the power of many numbers.
That is disappointing.
More snakes.
Oh, wow. And now Felix might actually get an Engineered Explosives to blow up infinite snake tokens. It's not over yet.
Sometimes all the snakes is still not enough snakes.
Wow.
And I wonder with the Whir of Invention, there was the opportunity to... it sets up the artifact and puts it into play. Is that correct?
Yes.
So that's the reason that he couldn't just go for a
walking ballista, because that would just die immediately before you can put a counter on it. Yeah, and this not only breaks up the snakes, but also kills the Espel Cornucopia. Oh, and the Chalice as well, maybe opening up Amulet of Vigor. That was a big sequence of plays for Felix.
All right, clip that one. When infinite snakes is not enough. It seems to me kind of awkward that the one snake that's hanging around is the Sakura Tribe scout on the other side of things, having to watch as all of its brethren just get completely obliterated by one set of explosives.
It's like snake genocide, except you have one left over.
Surge Node coming back. Nothing to put all these charge counters on. If only there was a Magistrate Scepter. And now, finally, Ancient Stirring's getting unlocked. It's just going to be a land. I mean, there's plenty of lands in the Amulet Titan deck, so that's not necessarily too surprising. Bajuka Bog the pickup.
Yeah, that might make the potential of, say, a Crucible of Worlds or something a bit less potent. But yeah, what is this game going to come down to now? Because Camilo has expended most of his resources in setting up some combo, but doesn't have much left. Well, he's trying to go for it again. This will take a while to set up, but eventually he will be able to make infinite mana
it's
again.
It's not going to take that long. He can tap Core Tap to put one counter on, tap Cornucopia to move a counter on Surge Node.
He actually has it on the next turn. Yeah. So if there's a walking ballista on top, that would be enough.
I mean, what are you to do when you've just got infinite mana and infinite untaps?
This deck is a masterpiece.
I mean, one Magistrate Scepter in this deck, you can tap and untap it and put all these charge counters on, take all the turns.
Right.
Is that a better plan than the Orochi Hatchery? I guess you can't search for it with Teleria West, so maybe not.
Yeah, that might be an issue. There's also an Artificer's Intuition in the deck that can also search for the Hatchery, but not the Magistrate Scepter. There's probably good reasons.
There's a bunch of good reasons. We found them all. Yeah. Mox Opal coming into play there.
Right, so now it looks like we are in waiting mode. Felix won't readily be able to attack with any of his creatures, given that Ensnaring Bridge is in play. Whereas Camilo is just waiting to draw, well, a kill condition to use with his infinite mana combo.
Teleria West, though, can fetch up. I mean, is there another Engineered Explosives? If there is, then he can just...
He has one in his main deck, and I don't see any in his sideboard.
Well, I guess we'll find out what he's searching for momentarily.
And he can always go for Summoner Spect, and then find Primeval Titan, and then use Primeval Titan to... find some things. Like often you get like a Talaria West and a bounce land so that you can get back the Talaria West. Oh, he also has an Academy Ruins in his deck. So that will allow him to recur Engineered Explosives from the graveyard. That is a long-term plan to work towards.
Yeah, hasn't gone directly for it with Teleria West, but obviously it's not as if that plan is off the table, given that Primeval Titan is going to allow for a whole bunch of shenanigans here. This has been a cool game.
Yeah. Because now maybe Camilo has one, perhaps two draws to find his walking ballista. Otherwise, I believe Felix will be able to assemble an Academy Ruins plus Engineered Explosives lock, so to say. Not so much a lock, but it will ensure a relevant piece of disruption every turn. That should be good. And he can get there indeed with a bounce land and then bring back to Talaria West. And then Talaria West can tutor for a land. Assuming that he still has some blue mana maybe left in his pool from tapping earlier. Apparently
now,
not.
The die on top of Felix deck there, just to remind him that he did play a Summoner's Pact that last turn. Does not want to lose the game to forgetting about the Pact. infinite counters on Astral Cornucopia.
Wait, it's not actually infinite, right? Yeah.
It is. It has. Well, I mean, it's a big number because he's using Core Tapper and then untapping Core Tapper to put.
That's how he's doing it, of course. Yep. That's okay. Convinced. And nicely putting down
a sideways 8.
A sideways 8 to represent the mathematical infinity sign. I mean, I guess you have to choose a number, but
Mana burn is not a thing.
The number is probably too big to be represented via dice. Ooh, and now we have Sorcerer's Spyglass, so that can shut down, well, either the Transmute of Tolaria West or Academy Ruins. Given that Camilo isn't sure if Felix has another copy of Engineered Explosives in his deck, maybe naming Tolaria West might be the best option here.
It will, of course, shut off his own copies of Tolaria West as well, though.
That's true. Especially when Tolaria West would be an instant win for him, given that it would provide Walking Ballista. It's kind of a close call. Alright, don't forget to pay for the pact.
Step 1, don't lose the game. That step.
Success.
It's a pretty important one in the grand scheme of things.
And Tolaria West was indeed the card, card name.
There is a Walking Ballista that's been drawn, but it's been drawn by Felix Steinitzer here.
Alright, that is a game plan too that can win even through Ensnaring Bridge. When you have so much mana, that's a pretty quick kill. Maybe he wants to... well, I guess taking out the Filigree Sages now is going to be a bit late, because that Astral Cornucopia already has more than enough counters by itself. So I don't think you can stop a top-decked Walking Ballista one way or another. Might as well let the creatures live, and maybe he has enough mana to come up to 14 counters on the next turn.
It's pretty close.
2, 3, 4. I don't think he's there yet. So if that is correct, Camilo has 2 turns.
And I think that Camilo drew a Tolaria West that turn that he can't use because of the Sorcerer's Spyglass. I think it may well still have been correct to name Tolaria West, even given that that was a possibility.
Yeah, I agree. Or you have to be really sure of Felix's deck list and name Academy Ruins. But there was no way for Camilo to know that.
I mean, 17 minutes left on the clock. This game shouldn't take too much longer, I wouldn't imagine. Either Camilo's going to go infinite and then actually get the kill, or this Walking Ballista is going to...
Yeah, the Walking Ballista will win in 2 turns, because Felix can add at least 4 counters with all of his lands. Is there Walking Ballista on top?
Walking Ballista, Whir of Invention. Well, there's a Whir of Invention. That'll do it.
Yeah, but you cannot just get the Walking Ballista, because it will be put into the battlefield as a 0/0 and die immediately.
Is there anything that the Whir of Invention can fetch? An Engineered Explosives. Interesting.
That one can kill the Walking Ballista.
If it does so, it's also killing your Infinite Astral Cornucopia and your Mox Opal. I mean, you got to do what you got to do. This has been an explosive game of Magic in a variety of ways.
It's like using all the pieces of the buffalo in order to stay alive. Yeah, I don't really see another way in Camilo's decklist that would have provided a win immediately here.
So this is Felix just getting as much damage through as he can before he loses that Walking Ballista.
All of these symmetric effects are coming back to hurt him. First, the Tolaria West on the Sorcerer's Spyglass. Now, Engineered Explosives also killing some of his cards.
So 2 out of 4 Astral Cornucopias down.
But if Camilo draws a fresh one, then he can pretty quickly go up to infinite mana once again. Yeah, and at this point, the I mean, we don't know exactly how the players sideboarded, but the most important cards still remaining in Felix's deck are Academy Ruins and potentially Zakama?
Or even just an Abrade.
Oh yeah, that can be cast as well. Take out the Ensnaring Bridge and then you can start to attack. And well, Camilo basically has to first find infinite mana again and then draw Walking Ballista.
I feel like Camilo there should have been using his core tapper to put counters on his Surge node, given that he's got nothing better to do with it, just so that he can make sure that later on the Surge node is relevant.
Good point. Well, there is the Ballista. Wait, so he first played a Chalice for 0, which he may be able to add extra counters to later. Then a Walking Ballista. No infinite mana yet, but well, eventually that can start to ping for damage as well and provide a win condition.
Core Tapper now, effectively, amongst other things, is a Prodigal Sorcerer. It can tap to give a counter to Walking Ballista that can then use that counter to shoot something. Is it? It's not charge counters. My apologies.
Yeah, Core Tapper only puts charge counters on artifacts, not +1/+1 counters.
Otherwise, we would probably have seen it see a lot more play in just straightforward affinity. Secure Tribe Scouts, Secure Scout. It's all about the snakes this game, apparently. Azusa Lost But Seeking. These are a lot of 1-drops. 1-power creatures, you know, and there's one card in hand right now for Camilo Lukesh. He needs to be just vaguely careful that he doesn't find himself in a spot where he just faces some attacks here.
Yeah, he is at 4 life only, so that could actually start to matter indeed.
Get those cards out your hand, Camilo.
He can cast Welding Jar. Currently it would be countered by Chalice, but he can put a counter on the Chalice first, so that his Welding Jar will not be countered. And that does give him some protection from any Abrades that Felix might draw. And empty-handed for Ensnaring Bridge. Safe for the moment.
Filigree Sages are there so that he's going to be able to get things going. Those Surge nodes.
Going up to 3 with the Chalice. Well, given that Academy Ruins is still a relevant card, but perhaps going up to 6 with Chalice might be an option to stop any Primeval Titans later on. I don't think I've ever seen a Chalice on something like 6, but might be possible.
So he's... Okay, so I'm trying to work out these Surge nodes. They don't currently have any counters on them. I'm trying to work out exactly how he's used them to put counters on the Chalice. It's kind of a messy situation where it might involve... Yeah, because removing a charge counter is part of the cost there. Yeah, I don't know what he's doing with that Surge node. This is what we're hearing. There are, in fact, infinite counts on the Surge node. It just wasn't being reflected very clearly.
He was able to do that earlier when he had infinite mana and then could untap his Core Tapper infinite times with Filigree Sages and use that to put infinite counters onto the Surge node. Wow, this deck is quite something. But
yeah, that's one of those things
it all checks out.
It will have been clear to the players on the table.
Inventor's Fair. That can maybe get the Cornucopia and then set up the infinite mana kill with Walking Ballista.
Yep.
Did Camilo get there?
Yeah, as soon as he gets Astral Cornucopia into play, he can just sacrifice 2 Core Tappers, stick 4 counters on the Astral Cornucopia. He's got Welding Jar around to keep it safe, Filigree Sages to untap it again. This seems to me like it should be the win here.
I think he did it.
What a game. What a game.
Apparently not. So what were we missing?
The purple die we're using to represent infinity. I'm sure that all of you purple fans appreciate that. Rurik Thar, though, that could be tricky, but for the fact that there's a Chalice on 6. I love it.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen a Rurik Thar being countered by Chalice of the Void, but this deck is doing all kinds of things for the first time.
All right, we're going to get a game 3, Frank, and frankly, I couldn't be happier about that.
This game showcased some interactions that I had never really thought of before. For example, using your infinite mana combo to put infinite counters on Surge Node. What? Rurik Tar being countered by Chalice on 6. This game was basically an example of everything that I like about Modern. You never know what you are going to face in this format, and opponents can always surprise you with the wackiest cards and the craziest combinations.
Yeah, look at the look on Kimilo's face there. He is having the best time. Like, I want to be playing his deck, in part because it seems super fun to play, but also because I love that moment where you look at your opponent's face as you're playing these cards that were marginal picks in draft, at best, and then you beat the snot out of people with it.
Yeah. Also, this is Camilo's first GP. It's not like he is a regular on this tournament circuit. It's his first time playing in a GP with his crazy brew and doing super well with it. That's a dream for many players.
Just 9 minutes left on this clock, and that's going to be an interesting one. If we go to turns, then it could go any which way. Each of these players have the potential, given the 5 extra turns, of doing a crazy amount of damage. I would probably put it on Felix as having an easier time winning before we hit time, but there's every potential for either of these decks to have incredibly explosive starts.
Yes, we've seen that in the previous games already. Access to a whole ton of mana as early as turn 2 is what both of these decks are capable of. So for some of you asking how did Camilo actually win that game, it was using Astral Cornucopia, an artifact that when you put 4 charge counters on it, can tap for 4 mana. Then Filigree Sages, a creature that untaps an artifact for 3 mana to make infinite mana, and then eventually sink all of that into Walking Ballista. It's a creative win condition, one that is slotted into an Ensnaring Bridge lock deck with Birth Invention and Tezzeret and those kinds of typical artifact lock pieces. But all of this search or like the charge counter angle is completely new to me, at least. Now,
I am intrigued as to how things have gone for Camilo this weekend in terms of specifically the card Stony Silence. If he finds himself up against a deck that has Stony Silence, what could he reasonably have been doing against it?
He has 2 copies of Beast Within in his sideboard that can act as a removal spell for the Stony Silence. Also Gearport Ether Grid, that still allows him to tap his artifacts for damage even when there is a Stony Silence. Besides that, the large majority of his deck is shut down when there is Stony Silence. He could also still win with Tezzeret the Seeker, but even casting that card when there is Stony Silence is going to be difficult because half of your artifact mana sources are shut down.
So far, the plays on this turn 1 are exactly the sorts of things from your turn 2 win. Surge Node not quite as potent as some of the other things that could have followed, but I mean, this is on turn 1 setting up so that he's going to untap with 3, if not more, mana available on turn 2. Amulet of Vigor on turn 1 from Felix Steinitzer.
Great draw for both players so far. Right, adding a counter so that now the Astral Cornucopia is stepping for 2 mana.
And Engineered Explosives on 1 and blows up the Surge Node and that Amulet of Vigor. That a trade that he will make all day long.
It's worth it. Amulet of Vigor is way more important to the Amulet Titan deck than Surge Node is for his deck. And he already got some value out of Surge Node.
Spellskite coming down. That a nice bit of protection. And casts a Walking Ballista here, gets it into play, and he will be able to chip through and also potentially kill off things like Azusa Lost Seeking if she comes down. So I kind of like getting the Walking Ballista into play here because once you've got infinite mana, it doesn't really matter that it's not quite as mana efficient to put counters on a Walking Ballista in play than when casting it.
True. Spellskite gives some Abrade protection, but it is also helpful later on in case Felix might play Primeval Titan and get, say, Slayer Stronghold. If you have Amulet and try to untap it and then pump the Primeval Titan, Spellskite can deflect that to get the pump from the Slayer Stronghold. That can help disrupt the Amulet Titan, or at least slow it down a bit.
So Camilo right now is one search effect away from winning the game. Another Welding Jar. Core Tapper gets to put a counter on the Astral Cornucopia, so it now taps for 3.
Yeah, if you can get Filigree Sages, he will have access to infinite mana and already the win condition on the table. Oh, he does have it in hand.
Wow.
He got it. Infinite mana, infinite damage.
7 minutes. No big deal. Let's finish with 4.5 left.
Incredible. I love this deck.
Yeah, this deck seems super duper sweet. Yes, it's one of those decks that I think that if people are prepared for it, there's lots of things they can potentially
No one
do about
prepared
it.
for this.
If you prepared for this deck beforehand, then quite frankly, your preparation is bizarre and, as it turns out, very fruitful if you end up playing against it at this stage. But wow, what a deck. Don't worry, you will be able to get a copy of this deck list at some point in the coverage later on. But for now, we're going to take a short break. Do not go anywhere. We'll be back with more matches after these messages. Hello and welcome back to coverage of Grand Prix Prague here in the Czech Republic. Tim Willoughby alongside Frank Karsten here, and we've just had a fantastic match that took almost the entire time of the round, but that doesn't mean to say that it took all of it entirely, which means we are going to get a chance to see a little bit more magic. We're going to get to jump back down to see Table 1. These are the two top players in the room right now. Javier Dominguez, the finalist from the World Championship, currently ranked 9th in the world. He is undefeated, up against Larry Pisper on hardened scales. And Dominguez, rather than just going with blue-white control, which is what a lot of the pros have gone with, he's on Jeskai.
Yeah, he felt that the addition of Lightning Bolt, Lightning Helix, and Electrolyze to his deck was valuable enough. And I think it will be a good addition for this particular matchup, because Larry Pispa's deck is relying on making some combo-esque approaches with his creatures. His deck revolves around hardened scales, which looks like he did not have in his opening hand. But with hardened scales...
which he has just drawn.
Okay. That may add an extra +1/+1 counter to any effect that adds a +1/+1 counter. And his deck is just filled with cards that do something with +1/+1 counters, like Steel Overseer. But even the Arcbound Worker, or this spicy one, Ruins of Oran Reef.
Yeah, this is a cool one. So this is a land that enters the battlefield tapped, and you can tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on target colorless creature that entered the battlefield this turn. So with a hardened scales in play, that's 2 +1/+1 counters you're putting on that creature. Just kind of a nice value addition to a deck that's already pretty light on the amount of colored mana that it needs. And you can see there, Pisper, he's kind of waving around that Steel Overseer. He desperately wants to keep it in play, but recognizes that it has got a clear target drawn on its head there, because Javier Dominguez will appreciate quite how powerful it is. And when Hardened Scales comes down almost assuredly next turn, it will be just an absolute monster.
Yeah, I don't think Javier is going to let Laurie untap with Steel Overseer. Apparently he does.
A bold choice.
I would say so, but I also think I see Wrath of God in Javier's hand. So it looks like he will just allow some of these existing creatures to stick around, wrath the board, and then keep his spot removal spells for any post-wrath threats.
So Pispa here, well known for having played control to high finishes in the past. Anytime he's playing a spell that he recognizes both of these players know is a big threat, kind of just holds it above the battlefield briefly to represent the fact that it's on the stack. Just attacks in here and then pumps with Steel Overseer, leaving mana open so that even if there's going to be a removal spell coming, he's potentially got a bit of mana up afterward.
Yeah, so this puts 2 +1/+1 counters on each of his artifacts. He also gets triggers from Animation Module, which allow him to spend the mana to make a 1/1 token.
And he can turn that token into a 3/3 if he wishes as well.
Yeah, with the Ruins of Oran Reef. Now, I'm pretty sure that if Javier doesn't really do anything in this attack, Laurie will recognize the potential for Supreme Verdict or Wrath of God on the next turn. No point in adding anything else to the board.
I'm really liking the look of this Ruins of Oran Reef here, because let's say that Javier does pull the trigger on a Wrath of God next turn, which would make sense to me.
Yes.
Larry can
seems
untap,
wise.
play one creature, pay a mana to create a second creature, uses Ruins of Oran Reef to put 2 counters on one of those various creatures, and he's done a fair job of rebuilding his board without really needing to do a whole lot of work.
Yeah, all of these non-creature cards that help him out are going to be quite valuable, and they do survive the Wrath of God. Still Hardened Scales and Animation Module left over. The Ruins of Oran Reef could also be pretty sweet with the Hangerback Walker that I believe he has in hand, because if you ever get to a turn where you perhaps sacrifice Hangerback Walker to, say, for Action Core on the battlefield, get a bunch of Topter tokens, well, all of them are going to get a big boost. Oh no, it's only a target creature, never mind.
Yeah, even though it's reminiscent of Oran Reef the Vast Wood, Ruins of Oran Reef only pumps the one creature.
Boo.
Turns out that when you ruin the Oran Reef, it gets substantially worse.
Well, still, Laurie is doing his best to rebuild his board, and immediately after a Wrath of God, well, Javier again has some threats to answer. But Javier is still at 9 life, and apart from Walking Ballista, the Hardened Scales deck does not really have a lot of reach. Unlike some affinity builds, it doesn't go for Galvanic Blast or anything of the sort. It is more of a combo deck, I guess you could call it, creature combo deck built around Hardened Scales.
If you already have an Arcbound Ravager in play, you can sometimes have a surprising amount of additional reach. But yeah, based on what's currently around, it's not as scary a board as many. Teferi coming along, immediately gaining in loyalty to draw a card and untap some land, and that meaning that Lightning Bolt is available now, still in the end of turn, just to get rid of that Walking Ballista before it can deal any more damage than it's currently threatening.
Yeah, choosing the Lightning Bolt over the Lightning Helix because almost surely it is not going to resolve. That Walking Ballista will just die by its own accord.
Welding Jar right on time there. It's a funny situation of, do you pay 2 or do you pay more for this Walking Ballista? Ends up paying 2 for it. It still comes into play as a 2/2 that he can turn into a 3/3, and he's got the mana to make an extra servo.
And still the Oran Reef available. Yeah, if he actually deals the damage to Teferi and then puts an additional counter on his Walking Ballista with the Oran Reef, and Javier has nothing, he can kill Teferi this turn while still having all of his creatures around. But Javier does have a path to exile. However, I don't think Javier can use that path to exile in such a way to ensure his Teferi sticks around.
Yeah, Walking Ballista, just too big a threat in this instance. I mean, he can...
Yeah, between the attack, the 2/2 Ballista, and the Runes of Oran Reef, Pispa effectively has access to 4 damage to sling towards the Teferi, and with the path to exile, Javier can only stop 1.
And the use of the path here at least means that Walking Ballista will be off the table going forward. And not having to worry about those is definitely something that makes life a little bit easier for the Spanish pro.
Yeah, and sitting at 9 life, facing only 2 servo tokens, and 2 cards in hand for Pispa, I think Javier will be feeling good about his spot in this game. Sure, Pispa still has lots of potential with the animation module and Hardened Scales, but he is running out of cards, whereas I, for example, spot a Cryptic Command and a Snapcaster Mage in Javier's hand. Those are the typical blue control cards that make sure that you're not gonna run out of gas. And I think Pispa also recognizes the threat of a Cryptic Command, unwilling to just play into it by casting a spell.
So there's the option of using Phyrexian Core here to sacrifice a servo in response to Lightning Helix, meaning that at least Javier Dominguez is not going to gain any life on that big removal spell.
The many uses of Phyrexia's Core. Generally just a one-off in the deck, but with so many death triggers like Hangerback Walker, some creatures are better dead than alive.
Ancient Stirrings finding Arcbound Worker.
It may just be a 1/1 for 1, but with Hardened Scales it becomes a 2/2, and with Animation Module you can make it bigger and or create an extra token.
There's also that Runes of Oran Reef as well, so bizarrely we're in a spot where Arcbound Worker, if it was a Ravager this would be an easier decision, but Arcbound Worker being met by Cryptic Command.
Yeah, haven't seen that in a while.
Yeah, what is this world that we're living in?
But now the Hangerback Walker might just resolve. So Laurie did a nice job in baiting out the Cryptic Command by playing his less important card first, and it worked out well in his favor.
He had an interesting choice there in terms of whether or not to make a servo or put 2 more counters on the Hangerback Walker, ultimately deciding to go wide rather than make the Walker bigger, which in the face of Path to Exile kind of makes sense.
Could be a bit worse against, let's say, a Lightning Bolt or Lightning Helix, but if Javier would spend such a card to deal with the Hangerback Walker, you get a bunch of Thopters in exchange, and you still have Welding Jar to protect it. So diversifying against Path to Exile is a play that I think works out well for Laurie here.
Now, it seems likely to me, Frank, that we're not going to be able to get all the way through the entirety of this match. We did finish our last match with just 4 or so minutes left on the clock, but very much enjoying this game one, and we will, of course, bring you the result of the entire match once it is completed. This is a time walk match after all. So there is Path to Exile thanks to Snapcaster Mage on Hangerback Walker. So no Thopters generated by that one, but at least the Path to Exile will mean that Larry Pisper gets to thin his deck just a little bit further, fetching out another land. All forests in terms of basic lands in the Hardened Scales list.
Yeah, I would say that this deck is a bit different from Affinity. It doesn't really run Ornithopter or Springleaf Drum or Cranial Plating, so it doesn't share the whole philosophy of dumping your hand onto the table as quickly as possible, also not as aggressive. It does feel like its own archetype entirely, even though it does share cards like Mox Opal, Arcbound Ravager and Steel Overseer.
Yeah, I mean, Ancient Stirrings, for example, coming from this Hardened Scales list, somehow a card that hasn't ever quite been able to fit into Affinity, that's looking for different colors a large proportion of the time.
Yeah, but this is also a deck that is made to that built its mana base to make it possible to cast Hardened Scales on turn 1. So then casting an Ancient Stirrings on turn 1 also becomes a reasonable possibility. When you can do that, Ancient Stirrings gets the value of potentially finding your second land drop, and that is the flexibility you need to put it in your deck.
So in response to Hangerback Walker there, Phyrexian Core getting dealt with by Field of Ruin, that makes sense. It just means that there are fewer ways for Larry Pisper to easily be able to generate lots of Thopters. It'll mean that if Dominguez is able to find another Path to Exile, for example, he's not going to face any Thopters at all, and on 5 life, that's definitely an attractive prospect.
Mm-hmm. This time does go for the attack. Javier seems to be in trouble here. His deck also doesn't have Terminus to deal with a Hangerback Walker. Many of his removal spells, except for Path to Exile, will try to burn or destroy it.
Just so you guys know, these two players undefeated. There was only one other undefeated match at the table, and that was Louis Del Toro was undefeated going into this round, but we've heard that he lost the round, meaning that these two players, as we're watching right now, the last two undefeateds, and ultimately, assuming it doesn't end in a draw, of course, the winner of this match will be the final undefeated player, and in great shape to be able to make top 8 here in the Czech Republic.
And Javier, without any relevant action in hand, goes to put Celestial Colonnade on blocking duty. I'm a bit surprised to see that the Hangerback Walker isn't attacking here. Laurie can tap itself to put an extra counter on it, growing it a bit bigger before putting it into the red zone. Maybe Laurie is afraid that Javier could trade his Colonnade for Hangerback Walker, untap and play Wrath of God, and he might be playing around that by making sure that he will keep his Hangerback Walker around.
So in response to a Field of Ruin here, Larry Pisper is doing his best to make the most of his animation module. So he puts counters on as many creatures as possible, generates more servos, and I mean, his board now looking pretty formidable considering the life total that Javier Dominguez has to work with.
Mm-hmm.
And a mass removal spell here from Javier Dominguez doesn't even achieve anything because of that Hangerback Walker.
Exactly. Yeah, this will be a tough one for Javier to win. It is still possible. Maybe it starts with a Cryptic Command, maybe bouncing the Hangerback Walker at some point, finding a Supreme Verdict. There's surely a sequence of cards in his deck that gets him out of this, but currently as it stands, he is facing lethal. He has Snapcaster Mage and Celestial Colonnade as a blocker, and at 3 life, whereas Laurie has 5 attackers. Laurie's still playing around some potential cards in Javier's hand, still doesn't want to give Javier the option of, for example, double blocking the Hangerback Walker, maybe Lightning Helix on a token, survive, untap, and Supreme Verdict. I think Laurie is still playing around that. I guess there's even
something like Settle the Wreckage, right?
That too. It is. I don't think Javier has it in his deck, but it has seen play in Modern. That could also be a card that he has in mind.
So Dominguez now on 1. Any further attacks will be enough to finish the Spaniard off.
And I see Schlappes in the chat asking Terminus maybe. That is not in Javier's deck. Typically only in the blue-white versions with Jace.
So Larry Pisper does pick up game 1, and we knew that we weren't going to be able to get a chance to bring you that entire match. In total, it did end up that Larry Pisper was able to win, but Dominguez took a game off him. It went to 2-1 to Larry Pisper. So Pisper currently the only player undefeated in the tournament. We'll get a chance to see presumably some more of him at some point later on because he's doing so well, but also all the rest that's been going on in the tournament. We will have more Magic for you with Riley and Simon after these messages.